Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of KRAD COVID Readings. I'm Keith R.A. DeCandido, doing readings to entertain you during our long coronavirus nightmare. This time around, I'm going to do something a little different. I'm going to be reading a piece of nonfiction, rather than the fiction that I've been reading for the previous readings. This essay collection just came out this year from Crazy 8 Press. It was edited by Jim Beard, assisted by Rich Handley. It is called ZLONK, ZOK, ZOWIE, the Subterranean Blue Grotto Guide to Batman 66, Season 1. It is a collection of essays about each of the storylines in the first season of the 1966 Batman TV series, as well as the Batman movie that came out between seasons 1 and 2. My essay was called Tropes Abandoned, Tropes as Yet Unseen. It was about the two-part episode Feathered Finks and The Penguins of Jinx, which was the second storyline that aired on Batman. And here it is for you now. While Batman is best known for its campiness and goofiness, the show also indulged in satire on more than one occasion. While it wasn't a regular feature of the show, when they did delve into satire, it was often clever and biting. Probably the two most obvious and strongest examples are the commentary on the art world in Pop Goes the Joker and Flop Goes the Joker, and the brilliant send-up of politics in His Honor the Penguin, Dishonor the Penguin. Plus, there was the send-up of world politics in the feature film. Their first shot at it, though, was in the very second episode, when Feathered Finks introduces us to Warden Crichton. The notion of prisoners' rights was still a relatively new and controversial one in 1966. Exactly 100 years earlier, the Supreme Court ruled that prisoners have no constitutional rights. That was Purveer versus Massachusetts, 1866. But the combination of riots due to unsafe conditions in the 1950s, riots which continued for 2 decades, culminating in the brutal Attica riot of 1971, and the civil rights movement of the 1960s, led to more and more advocacy and consideration for the rights of prisoners, as well as those accused of crimes. That 1866 decision was overturned in 1964 by the Supreme Court, unanimously, in Cooper versus Pate, establishing that prisoners did, in fact, have rights. Plus, of course, the very year that this episode aired also saw the landmark Miranda versus Arizona decision, which is why law enforcement is obligated to read people their rights when they're arrested or questioned by police. It was in this post-war era that the notion of prisons as institutions of correction rather than punishment came to prominence. The American Prison Association changed its name in 1954 to the American Correctional Association. More emphasis was placed on reform than on revenge. Not everyone thought this was such a hot idea, or a workable one. Batman in particular was predicated on the notion of returning villains. Cesar Romero, Burgess Meredith, and Frank Gorshin each appeared several times in the first season. And Julie Newmar and Victor Buono would return after singular appearances, which required them not to reform. The inability of these arch-villains to reform is actually a plot point in the second season's Catwoman Goes to College and Batman Displays His Knowledge. And Lorenzo Semple Jr. takes every opportunity to make fun of Crichton's reforms in the script. At least part of it is the generally broad nature of the show in general, but still, Crichton is played as a figure of fun, for the most part. His reforms treated with disdain. Crichton himself keeps constantly referring to them as progressive policies, making sure to emphasize that. Of course, it's one of the tropes of the show that everything is over-described, but this was only the second story. A lot of those tropes hadn't settled in yet. Just as an example, Wayne Manor was actually called just Wayne Manor, not Stately Wayne Manor, though it was then described as the stately home of Bruce Wayne. The policies themselves are actually pretty bizarre also. When prisoners are about to be released, as Penguin is, they're allowed to wear their civilian garb, and they're also placed in a special cell that has a hidden camera. It's not very well hidden, as Penguin and his henchmen, whose civilian garb includes a domino mask, just in case we weren't sure he was a bad guy, find it before they finish their conversation. It also reveals that Penguin hasn't reformed in the least, a revelation that leaves Crichton crestfallen. This is hilarious on several levels, of course. The first is that we've only seen Crichton's reformist sensibilities for 5 seconds, and they've been trashed pretty thoroughly. Also, Crichton went to the trouble of taping Penguin, but he obviously hadn't watched the tape yet, making you wonder what he was waiting for. Shouldn't he at the very least have taken a glance at it before he was helicoptered to police headquarters? Again, this was only the second story, but we were well on the way to the show's hallmark of showing that Batman is the only person equipped to deal with arch criminals like the Penguin. The Gotham City Police are comically ineffective throughout the series run. As an example, it never occurs to Commissioner Gordon that Penguin might use a pseudonym to buy an umbrella shop, and he totally misses the bog-obvious K.G. Bird nom de plume. And places like here, as well as his subsequent appearances, particularly The Greatest Mother of Them All and Ma Parker, where Parker took over the prison, Crichton is shown to be equally ineffective. In a lot of ways, it's a narrative cheat. The show is called Batman, and that means that the person who must always save the day is, in fact, the Caped Crusader. But the show repeatedly hedged their bets by also making Batman by far the only competent person in all of Gotham City. Every other authority figure we meet is really terrible at their jobs. Two that recurred, and were regularly seen to be imbeciles, were Crichton and Mayor Linseed. The latter was replaced in Nora Clavicle and the Ladies' Crime Club because his wife refused to cook or clean or wash his shirts until he appointed Clavicle to replace Gordon as police commissioner. He laments that he's worn the same shirt for weeks and hasn't had a decent meal in months. Clavicle's platform is that women can run Gotham better than men, and if the mayor doesn't know how to operate a washing machine or get his staff to provide him with clean clothes and food, you can kind of see her point. And Crichton's reforms are regularly lampooned and seen to be ineffective, which is necessary to keep the recurring villains coming back. In both these cases, it simplifies the task of the writers, because of course Batman has to be the one to maintain law and order, because if we left it to these garbanzos, the city would be doomed. The biggest offenders, of course, are the two in the opening credits, Gordon and Chief O'Hara. The 3 seasons of Batman are a chronicle of the spectacular failure of the Gotham City Police Department. In fact, in this episode, and also in the previous one, High Diddle Riddle and Smack in the Middle, is a piece of the opening formula that they dropped after this, but which shows up the GCPD's ineffectiveness. Most of the beginning of Fine Feathered Finks is what we're used to 5 decades later from the top of a Batman episode. A criminal does something, Gordon and O'Hara learn of it, they activate the Batphone, Alfred answers it at Wayne Manor, and interrupts Bruce Wayne and Dick Grayson in whatever they're doing, and then, after making excuses to Aunt Harriet, answer the call and slide down the Batpoles. All of that is present in this episode, but with one interesting variation. Gordon first asks for volunteers to take on the criminal du jour. The other cops all look away, and Gordon concludes that he must instead use the red phone that sits under glass. This notion was abandoned in fairly short order, as going forward, Gordon would simply say that there was only one man who could stop that week's villain and push the button on the phone. That's one of many ways that you can tell that this is an early episode, before they'd completely settled on all the formulae that would later come to define the program. For starters, as with High Diddle Riddle, Fine Feathered Finks ended with a cliffhanger that seemed tacked on and unnecessary, mainly because, in the early days of the show, it was intended to be a 1-hour drama. But when ABC gave it 2 half-hour slots in the same week, the cliffhanger format was inserted into the first episode and incorporated into future scripts. The one here is particularly weird, as Batman's plan to figure out the clues on the Batbrella are suddenly abandoned in favor of a plan to go to Penguin's umbrella shop as Bruce Wayne and plant a bug. Unfortunately, Penguin discovers the bug and puts Bruce in a death trap that he has to escape in the Penguins at Jinx. And another case of a trope not having settled yet, William Dozier's voiceover says to tune in tomorrow, same time, same channel, with no bat prefix yet. Later cliffhangers would, for the most part, put Batman and Robin in danger rather than the former's secret identity. And also, what's frustrating about this one is that it's so out of place. After he escapes the Penguin's clutches, Bruce returns to the Batcave as Batman, and he and Robin then try to figure out what clues there are on the Batbrella, just like they were going to do before they decided to bug the Penguin. And by the way, what's with doing warrantless eavesdropping on a private citizen? When the dynamic duo are meeting with Gordon and Crichton early on, Batman reminds Robin that Penguin has served his time and is no longer to be considered a criminal. Yet later on, he tries to bug the guy, which is illegal. Robin even declares that his saying Penguin should just stay in jail past his sentence was a stupid thing to say, an unusually spot-on self-critique from the Boy Wonder. Another trope that this episode doesn't indulge in, surprisingly, is everyone knowing who Bruce Wayne, or rather, millionaire Bruce Wayne, many have joked that he was so specifically referred to thusly that his legal first name was actually Millionaire with Bruce as his middle name, is. Penguin doesn't recognize him as the famous philanthropist when he comes into the umbrella shop to get his father's prize umbrella repaired. Though later on, in the feature film and other episodes, Penguin will know exactly who Wayne is. The Penguin's actual plan is clever, and this set the tone for a lot of the Penguin's appearances, as more than any of the others, he tended toward misdirection. Forming a security firm, the Penguin goes straight and not yet he ain't. Becoming a filmmaker, Penguin is a girl's best friend, Penguin sets a trend, and Penguin's disastrous end. Running for mayor, his honor the Penguin and dishonor the Penguin. Opening a fancy restaurant, the Penguin's nest and the bird's last jest, all distractions from his real plan. This one is particularly subtle, as Penguin has no idea what criminal act to perform. So instead, he commits acts that seem like the structure for a crime, but with no actual crime. To wit, giving away gag umbrellas at a jewelry store, which he then declines the opportunity to rob. Then he leaves a big-ass umbrella in the middle of a street with a tiny umbrella attached to it. But Batman is enough of a detective that he'll try to find clues anyhow, and with Penguin having bugged the Batbrella, he can listen in. This is played for laughs, naturally, as Batman and Robin make leaps in logic that the Hungarian judge would give a 9.5, and the deductive process he uses could kindly be considered tortured. This is one case where the story might have worked better later when we've seen the Caped Crusader and the Boy Wonder stumble their way to figuring out an abstruse clue, and seeing it made fun of works even better. Of course, 50-odd years on, we're all familiar anyhow. Burgess Meredith does a simply superlative job here. One of the reasons why Batman was so successful was its villains. In particular, the big four of Cesar Romero, Julie Newmar, Frank Gorshin, and Meredith all threw themselves so totally into the parts they played. In this first appearance, even more than the others, Meredith embodies the faux aristocratic air of the comics character. In another case of lack of expected tropes, we don't once hear the Penguin's trademark wah, wah. Meredith developed that in later appearances to cover his coughing. He had quit smoking, but the Penguin role required him to have his cigarette holder, lit, of course, yay 1966, and he didn't want his coughing to muck up his dialogue, so he developed that signature noise to cover it. Like many first season episodes, Dozier had his writers mine the comics for story inspiration, mostly motivated by the rushed nature of that first season, slammed into production in January 1966. In this case, the story is inspired by the Partners in Plunder story in Batman number 169 by Ed Herron, Sheldon Moldoff, and Joe Giella, which came complete with a giant umbrella in the middle of a Gotham City street. The big change was, instead of stealing a giant jeweled meteorite, which would be expensive to create, kidnapping a starlet instead, the much easier to hire Leslie Parrish. The starlet kidnapping plot also provides us with one of the earliest examples of yet another of Batman's classic tropes, the renaming of something real. Mostly the show did this with New York City locations and people. Short Island for Long Island, Spiffany's for Tiffany's, Governor Stonefellow and the aforementioned Mayor Linseed for Governor Rockefeller and Mayor Lindsay, and so on. And we get an early non-New York example here, as Dawn Robbins is in Gotham to do a photo shoot for Fun Boy magazine. Wahey! The opening at Wayne Manor, which only occasionally related to the rest of the episode, had an interesting bit of foreshadowing for the feature film, as Dick Grayson is doing his French homework. He's struggling with conjugating verbs, though he actually gets it mostly right, and frustratedly asks what he needs French for anyhow. Bruce points out that if everyone knew each other's language, it might finally lead to world peace. An optimistic point of view, the one that would be put into action when Batman reconstituted the United World delegates with their minds in different bodies. Overall, this is a great introduction to one of the show's best villains, and introducing several elements that would prove to be among the program's strong suits. If you want to get a copy of ZLONK, ZOK, ZOWIE, you can order it online from your favorite online book dealer. It's at Amazon, Kobo, BarnesandNoble.com. It might be on Smashwords. It's definitely on iTunes and all the other usual places. There's essays by all sorts of cool people, including editor Jim Beard, as well as Ed Cotto, Joe Crow, Chuck Dixon, who has actually written Batman, John S. Drew, who does the Batcave podcast, Pat Evans, Chris Franklin, Robert Greenberger, who wrote the 100 Greatest Batman Stories Ever Told, Dan Greenfield, Rich Handley, Paul Kupperberg, who has also written Batman comics, Will Murray, who has written comics, Alan J. Porter, a comics historian, Peter Sanderson, also a comics historian, Mark B. Raycop, Stephen Thompson, and Dayton Ward and Kevin Dillmore all have essays in here talking about Batman 66. So definitely if you're a fan of Adam West's portrayal of the Caped Crusader, you should definitely check this book out. There will be a volume 2, which is called Biff! Bam! Yow! The Subterranean Blue Grotto Guide to Batman 66, Year 2. And I'll be doing an essay for that one as well. So, thank you very much for watching. You can find me online at DeCandido.net. You can read my blog at DeCandido.wordpress.com. You can support me on Patreon at patreon.com/krad. And please, please, stay safe.